1991 will always have a special place in my heart looking back at it. Not only was my brother born that year, but it's arguably one of the greatest years in video game history. Look at the games released then. Just to name a few, you had Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past, Monkey Island 2, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles: Turtles in Time, Street Fighter 2, Battletoads, Sunset Riders, and Duke Nukem. Not only that, you had the releases of the SNES and Genesis, and to top it all off, you had companies that would become big-name players getting their start, such as Bungie and id Software. My point is that if you were a part of the industry at this time, then you were in heaven with all the noise the industry was making from various different players. A part of it, in 1991, Square made a bit of a splash themselves. They would release Final Fantasy Legend 2 and the game we are looking at today in Final Fantasy 4. Released as Final Fantasy 4 in Japan and as Final Fantasy 2 in North America, Final Fantasy 4 ended up becoming one of those game-changing titles for some people to get SNES, along with Super Mario World, The Legend of Zelda: and Link to the Past, and F-Zero. This is also yet another game that has gotten a lot of ports and ports of its remake. You can get this on the SNES. PlayStation 1 released as a 2-pack with Chrono Trigger called Final Fantasy Chronicles, the Wonder Swan Color, Game Boy Advance, PSP known as Final Fantasy 4 The Complete Collection, and available on the PlayStation Network. Not to mention it got a remake in 2007-2008 for the Nintendo DS that got ported to iOS, Android, and more recently released to Steam. I'll get into remake another time because it scarred some of my hatred over time. Not to mention it got a sequel in Final Fantasy 4 The After Years for the Wii. Talk about beating a dead horse or milking a franchise, man. Anyway, Final Fantasy 4 was once again another game that had a lot of the original people who worked on the other games, such as director Hironobu Sakaguchi, composer Nobuo Uematsu, and so forth. It was the first game in the series to have more of a focus on its story rather than gameplay. When it was released, it was beloved. Critics and magazines like Famitsu and Nintendo Power said it was one of the greatest games of the year, and over time it's been often called one of the greatest games of all time. Not to mention that this was the first Final Fantasy game I ever played and gave me a true love for not only the genre, but for the whole gaming industry. The plot is iconic. You play as Cecil, a knight that serves the kingdom of Baron. After taking the Crystal Mysidia, you discover something's wrong and that the king might not be telling you everything about what he's ordered you to do and why. Soon, you discover that not everything is as it seems. With monster attacks on the rise, you journey to see what the king of Baron is planning. That's about as descriptive as I can get without spoiling the game. For its time, it's a very well written plot and involving storyline. The graphics are awesome. This, along with games like F-Zero and Super Mario World, showed what the SNES early on was capable of. Monsters look high quality, bosses look epic, and it, in general, looks like a game that said, it only gets better from here, so ditch the NES for SNES. They also expanded in the animation department. Every character has its own animation pool, and it looks a lot smoother than the NES was capable of doing. The world of Final Fantasy IV is also a lot bigger. Levels are expansive, and in general, the game is just a whole lot bigger than Final Fantasy IV. There's really nothing bad I can say about the graphics. This is a stunning looking RPG for 1991 that made everyone take notice. The audio is pretty well perfect. The audio really did show off the sound chip in the SNES. Every track in the game is pure nostalgia for me, whether it be remixed or not. Whether it be the battle theme or the overworld theme, every track is perfectly placed for the events at that moment. I personally rarely think that Nobuo Uematsu was better than during the SNES years, and the final boss track is a perfect example of it. It's intense, it wraps up the story very well, and quite frankly, in my opinion, it's the greatest final boss theme ever. The gameplay sets a standard for Final Fantasy games to come. I've been playing this game since I was 7 or 8 years old, and I always, at some point, try to go back to it in some way, shape, or form. Not to mention, it wasn't until Final Fantasy IX came out that the game got really close to topping it, and I would argue whether Final Fantasy IV or IX was my most favorite RPG of all time. Even with or without childhood bias aside, you talk about games or bands that set the standard for industry. Bands like Pink Floyd, The Who, The Beatles, or even games like Ultimate 4 and Grand Theft Auto 3 that are hard acts to top because they had people completely compelled on a different level. Final Fantasy IV is yet another example of this. more so because of how it built up the main bad guy rather than how great the game played. Not to say the gameplay wasn't great, I'll get into that later. The reason why I think it's so great besides the combat engine is the storyline. The way they built the main bad guy is through how he looks at the situation like a chessboard. When you think he may lose control of the fight with Cecil, he has a way to have it so that it played into his hand. He takes advantage of things Cecil loves the most and forces him to confront actions they made him do through other means, such as getting him to indirectly murder another character's loved one, having him fight his best friend, and so on. This makes him, in return, more human because he wants to confront his own personal demons or skeletons. Not to mention, it's easier to root for the hero and more compelled to see the game to the end. Sure, some of the plot twists are as cheesy as WWE at its worst. The thing is, by the end of the game, the bad guy is built up to a point where he seems almost unstoppable, and it's complemented with a fight that delivers on all levels. Thus, elevates what's already a good combat engine to the point where it's more than just Final Fantasy on new hardware. The only issue left is the combat has to still deliver, and it does. The game innovates itself by using a new combat system that the game calls 8TB or Active Time Battle System. This pretty much is used throughout the franchise, and since I'm so sick of people typecasting games into so many specific genres, that I will throw this into a basic one. This is so my ADHD-riddled mind can remember it. This is what I like to call a be quick or be dead kind of RPG. Time is money, and Final Fantasy IV will cut your head off for taking too long. Every character has its own meter that charges. When it's full, you can select an action to use. Take too long, and enemies will take their actions before you. The game also makes timing more relevant than in previous games. Casting the right spell at the right time can cause massive damage or be a game changer in boss fights. You can also now have party up to 5 with switchable characters near the end of the game. In total, there's around 11 characters you can use. Every character has its own class, and because of how story-driven the plot is, they all play a role in the story. This is a big change from the characters just being pointless templates that they felt like in 1 and or 3, and makes them feel more involved than 2 did on the NES. There's almost nothing I can say that's bad about gameplay. The difficulty is reasonable, the fights happen at a reasonable rate, and it's so addicting in my opinion that when I start playing it, I would have to finish it. I think some veteran gamers will find it too easy, but it's more personal preference than anything. Besides, if you want to play a harder version, I suggest you go play the DS remake. This is a game you don't mess with, and I will get into why when we talk about the DS remake. Overall, Final Fantasy IV, in my book, is one of those few examples of a game that's as close to perfect as you can get. The plot is compelling with lots of memorable moments and characters, the music is iconic, and the gameplay wraps it up in an almost perfect game. The only issue some people will have is that the translation was bad. The thing is that I think Squaresoft wanted this game to be a part of the first wave of SNES games, so we got to expect there to be some problems. On a side note, according to Wikipedia, the various incarnations of the game have sold more than 4 million copies worldwide, and it's no wonder. This is and was the standard for other games to come, and a must-have for any fan of RPGs. Just don't go out and buy the PlayStation 1 version. The load times are terrible. There's really no difference between the SNES and PlayStation 1 versions besides a reworked translation, and it was tacked on as a 2-pack with Chrono Trigger. Not to mention the GBA version has a huge bonus dungeon. Overall, I would give Final Fantasy IV a 10 out of 10. This is probably, up to this point, my most favorite Final Fantasy game, period.